So, Joanne, thanks for joining us. Sanctions are the topic of the moment right now. Everybody's talking about this. And I was just hoping you could fill me in a little bit on why this is such an important issue for the industry and what's going on and what the challenges are.
And why it's an important topic right now. I think it's not a new topic. Sanctions, we've had tons of sanctions in place for many years, many different countries. But what's very topical right now is that there have been some very big fines. And so that has people concerned about being offside of the sanctions. As well, there's been the recent sanctions in Russia. And so that's a very big market. I've heard exposure figures like 20% of maybe some of even the London market exposure is Russia. That's huge. So now it's a very, very topical to be considering the risks. And then finally as well, I'd say that there's a lot of discussion going on right now about the insurance policies and sanctions clauses and bank loans and sanctions clauses in there. So very topical for all those reasons.
Absolutely. I guess the geopolitical sort of conditions at the moment lend this to be something people are looking at. But what are the actual risks involved with sanctions?
Well, I think it depends on which player you're talking about. So everybody's affected. So you've got insurers, you've got bankers, of course, you've got the companies that are dealing with these markets. So when you're thinking of trade and investment and sanctions, I would say the very biggest risk, and it does affect everybody, is the economic fallout. So sanctions are put in place to precisely for the reason of having an economic effect on the country that's being sanctioned. Of course, that ends up having an economic effect as well on all the parties dealing with that country. So from an exporter or an investor point of view, it's economic fallout from having to stop activity that could be, in the worst case, maybe their most central project or biggest export, and they have to stop that activity and look for new markets and opportunities. So that's the company side. For the banker and for the insurer, if the insurer is insuring the company or insuring the bank, in both those cases, there's big economic fallout as well. The sudden change in that economic situation or business model means that there's suddenly a whole different risk in the policy. Usually, the insurer or the bank wants the activity to be continuing on. So if the activity has to stop, then the insurer will pay a claim, or the bank, if uninsured, won't be getting their money back. So that is the very hugest risk. Then, of course, as alluded to earlier, there's also the compliance risk and the risk of, or legal risk, you could call it, where if you're offside of the sanctions, you can be penalized.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously you've mentioned these are very far-reaching consequences and risks for anyone who's involved in this chain. For you guys at EDC, you're an international insurer of investments and exports. What are the challenges that you're facing in being required to deal with this?
Well, there's a ton of challenges. Maybe I'll try to stick with some of the biggest ones. First and foremost, I would say it's the complexity of the legislation or sanction itself, the prohibitions. It's understanding them. It's often the language is very broad on purpose so that they can capture a lot of activity, but when it's broad, it's very hard to navigate and figure out if you're offside or not. So the complexity, big issue. Some of that can also be extraterritoriality, to use an expression, where sanctions, you might not be directly affected, but sanctions in another country can affect you. And the worst case that's getting a lot of attention right now is U.S. sanctions and just even using U.S. dollars as a link to those sanctions, which normally a European or even Canadian wouldn't normally think would apply. So complex situation to begin with. Another big challenge, I think, is the suddenness in which they can happen. Case in point, Russia, where 2 years ago, I think still, everybody was looking towards Russia, looking to build business in Russia. Our own government had Russia among its top objectives to help Canadian companies get business in Russia, export or investment. You have a big tide like that going, and then all of a sudden you have the sanctions, and so it's stop and change course very suddenly. And even we have many insurance products at EDC, short term up to longer term exposures. Even in the short term side, you can have goods already in transit and you're trying to pull back. But especially when you've got insurers of longer term contracts, very hard to stop in the middle and turn back. So that's sort of setting the stage. The other thing is kind of a very big ongoing problem is setting up adequate compliance processes or systems and due diligence in your underwriting that will have you avoid being offside of sanctions. So even if you understand them and then you want to implement ways to avoid them, that becomes a very big challenge as well. You have your own change management of your staff, your getting your underwriters to ask the right questions. So not welcome. Compliance procedures not welcome by your own underwriters internally, and even less so by your clients that have to provide a whole bunch more information.
Yeah.
And then maybe just one last big area for us is the policy documentation. And basically insurers would like to put clauses in their documentation, their policies, that allow them to exit, not pay a claim, if sanctions go into place and go offside.
Just going to worry the clients even more, I think.
Exactly. That's the last thing the client wants, or the biggest challenge of all.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's obviously a very important issue. As you say, not anything that's necessarily new, but that's still causing a lot of people to be thinking about what they're going to do going forward. So thanks very much for your time. It's
Okay.
much appreciated.